Et si on faisait quelque chose de plus important que de plus intéressant que m'écouter blablater? On va écouter quelqu'un qui a des choses beaucoup plus intéressantes à dire.
I started to talk to you about trait theory, and now I'm going to make a jump to biology. And that's a strange jump in some sense, because the two levels of analysis are relatively disconnected. But what's happening right now at the sort of outer echelons of personality research is that the workers at the forefront of the field are trying to integrate what's being established at the statistical level of analysis with what's known at the psychobiological level. And so this emerging science is known as personality neuroscience, and it's developed in a rather strange way, because the traits that were identified that I discussed with you on Tuesday, the big 5 traits, all emerged as a consequence of the statistical analysis of descriptors, characteristic mostly of the English language, although it's been duplicated in other languages. So, in some sense, it was an atheoretical model, right? It just came out of the linguistic data. So there was no real initial inferences about brain area or neurological activity or anything like that to drive the formulation of the Big 5 model. Instead, the Big 5 model came first, and then people started thinking, okay, can this be put into alignment with what we know about the brain? And so people have been hitting that pretty hard, I would say, over about the last, it's probably 30 years, something like that, because Hans Eysenck and his student Jeffrey Gray were pretty far along on this kind of thinking by, say, 1982, when Gray published his book, The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which the paper you're reading now, a model of the limbic system and basal ganglia, applications to anxiety and schizophrenia. That's a very short summary of the book that Gray published in 1982, which has been incredibly influential. If you're interested in going on in psychology, especially on the scientific end, but I would say pretty much regardless, if you're interested in going on in psychology, that's a very useful book to tackle. There's a newer version, and it was published by Gray and McNaughton in, I think, 2000, something like that. It's hard going, and you may have found the paper that way too. Gray was a very, very, unfortunately he died a few years ago. He was a very, very smart person, and he knew the animal literature on behavior, neuroanatomy, and neuropsychopharmacology inside out and backwards. And so whenever he defined a term, he always made sure that the term was intelligible at a behavioral level and at an anatomical level and at a pharmacological level. It had to, the ideas that he were developing had to make sense at these multiple levels of analysis before he would accept them as genuine. And Gray did a remarkable job of extending our knowledge of the biological and evolutionary basis of at least the first 2 personality traits, say extroversion and neuroticism, roughly corresponding to positive and negative emotion. So that's partly why you're reading Gray. And Gray's theory is also cybernetic theory. Cybernetic theory is a variation of a theory developed by an MIT cognitive scientist named Norbert Wiener, who was an early AI, artificial intelligence researcher, and he proposed that intelligent entities were goal-directed and that they organized their behavior around reducing deviations from a goal while they were approaching it once they had decided what it would be. And that's also proved to be incredibly influential. We'll talk a fair bit about cybernetic models as we progress. So Gray is sort of a combination of artificial intelligence, cybernetic theorizing, and then an incredible amount of data that's come in from animal behavioral research. And as far as I'm concerned, most of the things that we know about the brain have been derived from animal research. The animal researchers tended to be extraordinarily careful scientists. They were influenced by B.F. Skinner, who established the initial theoretical basis for understanding how animals learn. We'll talk about that a little bit next class. So anyways, that's the context within which Gray is working. Ledoux, these are all papers you're going to read except the third one, which is optional. Ledoux is also he's an affective neuroscientist, so he's someone who studies emotions, mostly, again, animals. And Ledoux has done a lot to sort of add some of the pieces that were missing in Gray. Gray probably concentrated a little bit too much on a brain area called the hippocampus, which is the brain area that sort of lets you know if it's reasonable to be calm where you're currently situated. And so what the hippocampus does in some sense is compare what it is that you want to have happen with what is happening, and if the two things are the same, then you're calm. So it's a match-mismatch detector, and it has access not only to memory, but also to formulations of, say, the desired future. Swanson, I had people read the Swanson paper last year. I put it in your reading list as optional. It's worth hacking through if you can manage it. It's a very hard paper, though, which is why I took it out of the required reading list. The reason I like Swanson, we're going to talk a fair bit about him today, is Swanson's not a psychologist. He's actually a developmental I can never say this properly. He studies developmental anatomy. We'll do that. And so he's very interested in how the brain unfolds across time during embryonic development and then up into maturity. And so he understands the brain differently than a psychologist would, because a psychologist tends to analyze the brain, as a sort of mature thing, usually in adulthood. But for Swanson, it's a much more living and transforming system. And he's trying to set forth a schema for understanding brain anatomy and also associating that with function. And you might think that that's a well-advanced science already, that we know how to segment up the brain and we know, roughly what the pieces do, but we haven't even really managed to establish the terminology properly yet. It's neuroscience is a very new field, and there's no limit to the number of things that we don't know about it, including even the basic classification structure. Now, Swanson has put forth a very intelligent basic classification structure, and part of the reason that I think it's so relevant to a personality class is because it maps in a beautiful way onto some of the things that we've already talked about, especially Piaget. So there's a nice direct mapping of Piaget's developmental theory onto Swanson's theory of neurodevelopment and then of neural function, and that's completely accidental because Swanson never cites Piaget, so they're non-overlapping literatures. And I kind of like that because, if something pops up in one place with one method and pops up another place with a completely different method, especially if those two places are distinct in terms of their historical development, you might start thinking there's actually something there. It's sort of like seeing something and hearing it at the same time. You've got two independent sources of data. It's like triangulation in a sense. And so it was very exciting to me to come across this paper by Swanson. I think he's one of only two scientists I ever wrote a fan letter to. I mean, really, it's a brilliant paper. And then there's other reasons why it maps onto what we're going to talk about too, because Swanson also points out quite clearly the function of he kind of roughly separates the hypothalamus into two halves, and he points out that they have quite distinct functions, and the functions also map onto some of the things that we've been talking about in a very lovely way. And so there's a lot of reasons to go through Swanson's paper carefully. It's like 50 pages long, but the guy put it, in some sense, his whole life's work is in those 50 pages. So, even if it takes you 12 hours or 20 hours to read it, it's like, that's not too bad if you're going to extract out like 30 years of solid research. Gray's book is the same. Like, if you read that book, you've got, if you read it and understand
That's not too bad at all.
You've got a fair chunk of neuroanatomy, a lot of animal behavioral analysis, so behaviorism in general, a lot of psychopharmacology, and a lot of understanding of the functional.
Alors, tie break. Si on faisait un truc fun, je me suis donné. J'ai réfléchi à un défi que je vais me donner. Attends. Tiens, je sais pas. 3 personnages. J'en ai fait 3 là au moins. Même si c'est très nul. très très moche, mais bon, bref. Ok, actualisation, 3 caractères. Et visuel de Loïc. Ok, et je vais rajouter. Et le visuel de Miss Texas. Miss Texas. Ok, cool, donc ça c'est fait. Ouais, je me suis donné un défi. Il faut absolument que j'arrive à tu vas voir. L'idée en fait c'est que je vais essayer tous les jours de faire des blagues de merde. Ok, c'est parti. Je vais m'entraîner à faire des blagues pourries. Mon dieu. Attends, est-ce que j'ai suffisamment de temps? Je vais peut-être couper et, et faire un autre audio. On va faire ça. Un audio d'idiot. Let's go!